Looking at the international dimension, when did you first go to Moscow?
1956, to the 20th Congress.
So you'd actually been active in a senior level of the party for a long time then. What, close to 20 years?
Well, I was elected to the Executive Committee in 1943, Political Committee 1945, and I took up full-time work in, it was late 49 or early 50, I'm not sure precisely when I became Assistant Secretary of the party. So I'd been a full-time worker for the party for about 6 years before I went to Moscow, but I'd been a member of the executive for much longer.
With hindsight, at least, you couldn't want a more historic congress for your initiation into
it was being plunged in at the deep end, certainly, yes. Yes, I was there with Pollitt and Dutt. We were the three delegates from the British party.
And the story goes, now, correct me, I know we touched on this last time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were visiting a tyre factory on the day of the secret speech.
Well, we assume that that's the day the secret speech was made. We have no evidence that it was actually that day, but it was a day when we weren't at the Congress, and I think it was the day when other fraternal delegates, as we used to be called, were sent to various other places to make speeches, meet the workers and so on. So we've always assumed that that was the day on which the secret speech was made.
So in a sense you were all parcelled out and strangely but organisedly absent when Khrushchev made the speech?
Yes, it didn't seem strange at the time because it was a convention in those days and indeed for a long time afterwards at various Communist Party congresses for people from other countries to not just be in the Congress but sent out and to other places, other cities, workplaces and so on. So there was nothing strange about that. Of course, the actual public sessions of the Congress, we knew something was up because of the various rather veiled allusions that were made. Mikoyan said we've had no collective leadership for 20 years, which caused somewhat of a stir in the Congress, as you can imagine. So the existence of what became known as the cult of Stalin had already become public knowledge to that extent, but it was not in anything like the horrific detail that was revealed in the secret speech, which we didn't know about at the time and not for some time afterwards.
How would you characterise relations between Moscow and what was, certainly from their perspective, one of the smaller parties in their ambit?
Well, the relations between the British Party and the Soviet Party were at that time and throughout really on a very friendly basis. It's perfectly true we were a small party and they, I suppose, could have been forgiven for treating us in a rather offhand way, but they didn't. Of course, I think that both in relation to our party and other small parties, the attitude was very much conditioned by the developments in the international communist movement subsequently, because both the Russians and the Chinese were anxious to get the maximum support they could in the international communist movement, and so both of them went out of their way to influence and be friendly to the smaller parties as well as the big ones. Obviously the big battalions were more important, but the small ones were regarded, especially the non-governmental ones, were regarded as from the, I suppose you could call it the public relations point of view, also important. I mean, nobody regarded as extraordinary that the Polish party should support the Soviet party at that time because of the state relationships and so on. But a party like the British party, which hadn't got that degree of reliance, although it did have a good deal of reliance, as you know, on the Soviet party, nevertheless it was held that it might be a bit more independent in its outlook, and so there was a lot of competition between the Russians and the Chinese for our favours, as it were.
So you went to Moscow for the first time in 1956. You've been active in King Street for several years, based in King Street. and this was a period of the Cold War. What sort of level were the Soviet people who came to see you in London?
Well, I didn't have a lot to do with the Soviet people in London. Harry Pollitt was the main contact, and I used to see the person who occupied the position of press attaché, or at that level. I really only used to see the ambassador at receptions, the various official receptions at the Soviet embassy. But it was very much Harry's responsibility to maintain contact with them. So I personally didn't have a great deal to do with them.
But nevertheless, the relationship was quite close.
Oh, very much so, yes. I mean, Harry was in constant, frequent contact with them, without any question.
And we now know that there was also a financial relationship.
Yes.
In a sense.
Well, whether it existed at that time, the revelations of Reuben Felber dates from 1957, if I remember rightly. Now, whether it existed before that, I don't know. It certainly existed in the early years of the party, and some information, or at any rate estimate, of the degree of support in the early years was given in that government, I think it was a blue book, wasn't it, after the raid on the party in 1925, when they found a lot of documentation showing the degree of support from the Comintern and the CPSU. How long that continued, I don't know. It's interesting, the other day I came across a memorandum which Dutt wrote on his experiences in the International, in which he describes a meeting in Moscow, I think it was in 1923, when he says he made various propositions about future relations, one being that financial support to the British party should cease on the ground that it was an unhealthy position. Another was that, I've forgotten the exact phrasing of it, but really the essence of it was that he was opposed to the policy of setting up or encouraging the kind of minority movement organisations in the trade unions. So it's interesting that at that time Dutt was already raising, if his memorandum is to be accepted, the necessity for independence, financial independence from Moscow. But evidently he didn't get... Well, he says that all his propositions were rejected, although he then says they were subsequently accepted, implying that he, at any rate, thought at the time he wrote the memorandum that there was no financial support from the party.
What made Reuben Felber's revelations, public revelations, quite so fascinating, particularly for the media, was not so much that money was being handed over, but the means by which it was being handed over. Were you aware of that at the time?
I didn't know the mechanics of it. I knew that there was money coming because when I was editor of the Daily Worker, as it was then, I knew that there was money coming via Reuben to the Daily Worker. But I was never involved in how he got it and the mechanics of it. So I didn't know that. I mean, I assumed he was getting it via the embassy, but...
You didn't know about the sort of the carrier bags and the used fibres and that sort of thing?
No.
You mentioned me, just chatting last time I was here, I referred to it a short while ago. The time you went to Moscow, it must have been around about 1960, the time of the Sino-Soviet split. How evident was the split? Actually, before we do that, let me go back a little bit. Let's talk about the Yugoslav split, which I think in chronological terms makes more sense. You were working in King Street at the time.
Yeah.
What sort of impact did the Tito break have in terms of international relations and atmosphere within the party itself?
Well, it caused a considerable amount of certainly discussion and, of course, a certain amount of dissension in the party. because there had been quite close relations with the Yugoslav people, and a number of leading people in the party, like James Klugman, for example, had a very close relationship with the Yugoslavs. When James was in Cairo during the war in the army, one of his responsibilities was the British. I mean, he wasn't solely responsible. He was one of those responsible for the British armies and the British government's relationship to the Yugoslavs. And there's a book been published in America which purports to, there he is, which purports to show that he was the fifth man, as they call it, and was very much responsible for the fact that Churchill eventually supported Tito as against Mihailovich. This book is really designed to rehabilitate Mihailovich and to whitewash Mihailovich. So there was this and James wasn't the only one, there were other people, and in any case, in the immediate post-war period, Tito's prestige in the communist movement, including in Britain, was quite high because of the role which the Yugoslav partisans had played in kicking out the Germans, and I think they were generally regarded as having played more of a part, possibly, than some of the other than the communists in some of the other occupied countries, although the prestige of the French party was also very high because of its role in the resistance. Anyway, it came as quite a shock when there was this denunciation of Tito, and it caused there wasn't a huge split in the party. It was a relatively small number of people who actually left the party. I think there were more who had doubts about what was happening. But there continued to be the situation of general readiness to accept that what the Russians said, they knew more than we did, they had more experience. You know, this sort of attitude was probably right. And so the dice were loaded against any people who dissented from the Russians. The view tended to be to give weight to the Russian view and to discount what the other people said. And so even James Klugman, I think, much to his subsequent regret, he wrote a book called From Trotsky to Tito, which was a full-scale denunciation of Tito and full-scale support for the Russian position at the time. So that was the situation in relation to Tito, and it was really not until after the 20th Congress when it became clear that there had been a lot of errors and mistakes and blunders and crimes and all the rest of it under Stalin that our party accepted that it had made a mistake in relation to Tito, as of course the Russians did. I mean, Khrushchev went there and met Tito and made it up.
Edward Upward, in his novel The Rotten Elements, which is has a veneer of fiction, basically it's supposed to be that, suggests that people who were critical, particularly of Pollitt, at the time of the Tito split, were accused by people high up in the party of being in the pay of the Yugoslav embassy, of being plotters and splitters.
Well, they were certainly accused, I think, of being plotters and splitters. I don't remember myself ever hearing the allegation they were actually in the pay of the Yugoslav embassy. It's possible somebody might have said so. I don't think it was ever said in any public party statement, and I don't actually recall it having been said in any of the discussions in the executive committee or the political committee, although in relation to this interview as a whole, I have to say that do not rely on my memory exclusively. I have to, when I say things about the past, I always try, if I possibly can, to corroborate what I do remember with either notes or documents or whatever I can find to either substantiate or disprove what I think I remember, because my memory isn't very good now, especially after that length of time. So, as I say, I don't remember, but certainly there were very strong views about the pro-Tito people, as there had been about the Trotskyists, of course. I mean, they were classed as, in fact, more or less as Trotskyists. From Tito to Trotsky, that was from Trotsky to Tito, that was the title of James Klugman's book.
Moving back to the Sino-Soviet split, and you saw signs of that when you were in Moscow in about 1960?
Well, the signs of the split were preceded that meet. That was a World Conference of Communist Parties in 1960, but before that the split had become evident. The disagreements with the Chinese and between the Chinese and the Russians were obvious. And I think it was at a Bucharest, probably the Bucharest Party Romanian Party Congress in Bucharest earlier in 1960, that Khrushchev had made a speech which the Chinese took great exception to, in which, whether he mentioned them by name, I don't know, because for a time there was the convention of not mentioning the other people by name. You said certain persons say this or certain persons say that. But it was, whether he's mentioned them by name or not, I don't know, but it was taken as read that that's who he was talking about. And the Chinese took great exception to it and said it was a surprise attack and so on. The differences were expressed around issues like the non-inevitability of war, because the Chinese took what they regarded as the orthodox Leninist position that while imperialism continued to exist, wars were inevitable, and the Russians were taking the view that the world situation had changed and wars weren't inevitable and you had to emphasize peaceful coexistence and so on. And the other big issue was the path to socialism, because the Chinese took the view that there was no possibility of a parliamentary path to socialism. It was a question of, still a question in the end, of violent revolution. And so they disagreed with the Russians and quite a lot of other parties, including our own, on that issue. There were other issues as well. Now, it's very difficult to estimate to what extent these were due to different interpretations of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, and to what extent they actually were basically differences of state policy, of nationalism, of chauvinism, and so on. Sometimes the differences in state relations were, as it were, dressed up as ideological differences, I think. So what disentangling what was, as it were, genuine from, in the sense of a genuine difference of opinion among people who called themselves Marxist, from the state relations between the Soviet and the Chinese governments is not very easy. And I mean, at the time, we more or less accepted that it was simply an ideological dispute, although it was even then not possible to not to see that there were different state differences. I mean, we can go on later on, if you like, to talk about a visit we made to China, Golan and I, to China in '63, because then we were brought up against the fact that there were more than ideological differences quite sharply, which I can tell you now or I can tell you later, depending on whether you want to.
Well, let's start by talking about what was the Moscow meeting in '60.
Yeah, let's do it chronologically. Yeah. Well, there, again, the meeting itself was really, I think, called because each side wanted to get the maximum international support for their position. I think, I can't remember now the prehistory of it, but I think it was called mainly on a Soviet initiative. I mean, our party, with one or two others, had proposed such a meeting, I think earlier, in the late 50s. I don't think the Chinese were against it, but anyway, in the end, it was convened in Moscow, and all the parties were invited there, except the Yugoslavs, and I don't know whether there are any others not invited. And it went on. I was there right from the beginning. There was a preliminary meeting. Secretariat, I think it was called, and then there was a preparatory meeting, and then there was a plenary sessions at the end. It was 7 weeks altogether. I was stuck in Moscow. The discussions for me only being relieved by nightly visits to the Bolshoi and the Moscow Art Theatre and so on, which were very pleasant, of course. And it was a series of set speeches, really, from all parties concerned. I mean, you couldn't really say that there was any proper, what we would class as discussion. It was a series of set speeches, and people modified their positions in the course of it, not primarily, I think, because they'd changed their minds, but in order, in the end, to try to get agreement, because it was generally accepted that it wouldn't be a good idea not to agree in the end on something, and nobody wanted to be accused of being responsible for a split at that time or for breaking it up. So there was a common interest in trying to reach some agreement. But the atmosphere, I think, of a mutual distrust can be best conveyed by the fact that we sat at there were two long tables in the Great Hall of the Kremlin, and a table at each end, and the main protagonists sat facing each other, the Russians and the Chinese, on either side, on the tables at the side. I was sitting at the end, so that I could see both sides. And every time Ponomarov, who was one of the principal Soviet representatives at the meeting, spoke to someone at either side of him, he put his hand over his mouth so that the Chinese sitting opposite him couldn't lip read what he was saying. I'd never seen that happen before. I mean, maybe it happens quite often in international conferences, but it's the first time I'd ever seen it. It was extraordinary to see it at an international communist conference. I didn't see anyone, as far as I remember, I didn't see anyone other than Ponomarov do it. But anyway, he certainly did. And he was well, he is still, I suppose. I mean, he's still alive as far as I know. A shrewd and cunning operator. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived Stalin and Khrushchev and then Brezhnev. So, anyway, he certainly didn't want the Russians to know what he was saying to his pals on either side of him.
So you went to China in '63. Now, the British Party was always, I mean, there were very few Maoists in the British Party, and the split when it came in Britain was very small indeed.
Yeah.
So why did you go?
Well, we took the view that we might, well, probably it was very unrealistic and a bit egotistical of us, but we did think we might be able to play some part in preventing the split getting any worse. And in any case, there were, in our own party, there were people who wanted to know what was going on, what was, apart from what was being said publicly, what the private views of the various parties concerned were. And so we went to Moscow and talked to the people there, and then we went on to Peking and talked to them there. In Peking, the main person, we were met at the airport by Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi and others, Kang Shen. But the main talks were with Liu Shaoqi, and I think we were there about a week altogether. Again, whether you could call it a discussion is a moot point. It was, Liu Shaoqi made a long introductory thing about their position and explained their differences with the Russians. He seemed to have a copy of our program, The British Road to Socialism, which from their point of view contained the most horrible deviations and revisionist formulations, by his side, which he occasionally mentioned, and there was a sort of implied, I don't know whether you could call it a threat really, that he was going to really have a go at this document at some point. He never did, in fact, and while he expressed their differences with the Russians and their differences on the political questions like war and peaceful coexistence and so on and so forth and the road to socialism, he never actually launched the onslaught on the British road, which we'd rather expected he might do. And indeed, all through that piece, the Chinese were very restrained in their attitude to the British party. Partly, I think, partly they wanted to get us on their side, and partly, I think, because they had a genuine feeling towards the British Party because of what it had done in the pre-Chinese Revolution period, and the part that British communists like George Hardy and Tom Mann and others had played in supporting, and our party in Britain in supporting the Chinese communists. So I think there was a sort of genuine feeling of, they disagreed with us, but they were sad about it, as it were. And so, but to give you an instance of the way they treated us, I mean, we were put up in the most marvelous conditions. I suppose they were the sort of buildings reserved for visiting dignitaries. In fact, Johnny and I, it was all on the same level, the floor, and we had to walk about 20 yards or 50 yards or something to get to each other because it was so enormous. And having taken our cue from Ponomarov, Johnny and I never used to talk to each other when we wanted to say things that our host might have not liked in front of a telephone or indoors. Indeed, we used to go out for a walk in the garden to have confidential discussions about what was going on. I was saying, to give you an instance of the way we were treated, they put on a special performance of the whole Chinese opera. Now, you know the Chinese opera is not like Western opera. The Chinese opera consists of, the Peking opera it was, of about 200 performers, actors, acrobats, musicians, you name it, they do it. And it's an incredible show that they put on, and of course they came to Britain and put it on here, and a lot of people saw it, and it really bowls you over. They put this on specially for Johnny and I, got all these 200 people, put them in the main, I've forgotten what it was called, a Great Hall or something, in the afternoon. There were a few Chinese there, officials who were looking after us and so on, but we were stuck there in this enormous, I don't know how many people, the normal audience would be 6,000, probably 5,000 or 6,000. We were stuck there watching this fantastic show. I've got pictures of Johnny and I with the participants all lined up on the platform afterwards. So, I mean, it was really extraordinary, and it was rather embarrassing, of course, to have that, to think of all those people being dragged out and put on this show, and very physically exhausting for some of them because of the acrobatics involved, just for the sake of a couple of people from Britain, extraordinary. But that's what they did.
A couple of people from Britain who weren't going to back the Chinese.
Anyway, yes, because it didn't have any effect on us politically, I'm afraid. And I was saying earlier on that we got an indication of the degree to which state relations were involved because the Chinese offered to show us documents relating to their differences with the Russians about the naval situation in the Far East. I've forgotten the details about it now, but there was a big dispute between them about either naval bases or a radio station or something. Anyway, it was military matters and military and naval matters that were involved. And they wanted to show us these documents, and Johnny Gollan refused to see them, saying, we're not going to look at anything that we're not allowed publicly to talk about when we get back, which was I think a correct position to take, although I must say I would have been sorely tempted myself to have a look at them. But anyway, that was the position we took. And the Chinese were very cross about that. They were really angry that we didn't take advantage of this opportunity to look at this stuff. It was interesting because very often the Chinese attitude was clearer from the interpreters than from the bigwigs. That was even the case at the 1960 conference, because they had a young man interpreting there from Chinese into Russian who was far more vigorous and theatrical in his interpretations of what was said than the people who had said it. I mean, there was an old boy who did a lot of the work for the Chinese in the preparatory meeting called Kang Shen, who was one of the leading figures in the Chinese leadership. And he was a chap who, apart from Liu Shaoqi, looked after us when we were there, and a very nice chap. And he was very mild in his appearance and his lack of gestures and his manner of speaking. He was called Jigger Jigger by the Chinese, by the Russians, because apparently the Chinese for so to say sounds something like Jigger Jigger. So the Russians, not the leadership, but the people whom we used to come into contact with on a day-to-day basis, more minor officials, they used to call him Jigger Jigger. But as I say, the interpreter was completely different. He would gesture and wave his fist at the Russians opposite when he was interpreting what Kang Shen had said in his rather mild way. And it was the same with us in Peking, because the interpreter, we had a woman, middle-aged woman comrade, who was usually quite pleasant and affable and so on. She was personally very angry when we didn't take these documents about the naval situation in the Far East, and made clear her profound displeasure with us.
How?
Well, just by her attitude, and I've forgotten what her actual words were, but she certainly made clear that she thought we were being discourteous, and I don't know, I suppose she thought we didn't want, she probably thought we didn't want to see them because we thought they might convince us that the Russians were wrong, I don't know. But
did you meet Mao?
I never met Mao, no. Johnny Gollan met Mao in 1957 at the conference. There was a previous conference in 1957 before the 1961, and Johnny met Mao there. By met Chu Enlai. I can't remember when that was. That was after the 60. I don't think Chu was at the 60 conference. It must have been later on, 61 perhaps. I met him briefly in Moscow.
Of the Soviet bloc leaders you've met down the years, are there any that have made a particular impact on you, either for good or for ill?
Well, obviously, I suppose the one who made the greatest impact was Khrushchev, and on Khrushchev I have mixed feelings, because I think on the one hand he did a remarkable job in exposing what Stalin had been up to, obviously in the face of considerable opposition within the party leadership, many of whose members had gone, well, like he himself had been brought up under Stalin and brought into position by Stalin. And the fact that he did it in the end was undoubtedly something very much to his credit, no doubt about that. And I think on general questions of policy, like the question of peace and war and the question of the transition to socialism, the position he took up was basically one that we agreed with. So we were very disturbed when he was removed. Of course, there were aspects of his policy that one couldn't fully endorse, and I mean, a lot of people in the Soviet Union, apart from his, what you might call his top-level political opponents, weren't very happy about the way he behaved sometimes, banging his shoe on the table at the United Nations. They thought that was beneath the dignity of a great power like the Soviet Union. And undoubtedly he was an impetuous and sometimes adventurist in his policy. I mean, sticking missiles into Cuba wasn't exactly although he would claim afterwards that it helped to bring the Americans to heel a bit about Cuba, but I don't think it was a very good idea in retrospect. And of course we weren't very happy about that, because we, as a party, took the official line that it was all cooked up by the Americans, and that the photographs they produced were fakes and so on. So we went along with it, and then we were left in the lurch when Khrushchev had to admit that they were there and indeed agree to withdraw them. So Khrushchev did a lot of what the Russians called them harebrained schemes. I mean, his idea that you're going to grow maize everywhere in the Soviet Union virtually to solve the problem of agriculture was such a harebrained scheme. So they got rid of him, and we weren't too happy about that. And in fact, Johnny and I went to Moscow after he was removed. That was 1964, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, whatever year it was, to express our concern and to hear their explanation of what had gone wrong. We weren't, I must say, terribly impressed with Brezhnev, who seemed a very, well, I think, as he proved to be a very orthodox and not at all flexible in his approach, and saying things that were obviously untrue, talking about the monolithic unity of the Soviet people just after they got rid of Khrushchev, as if everybody, as if the 99.5% votes they got in the elections applied to people's views on things like Khrushchev, which is obviously not the case. So we weren't very impressed with Brezhnev. And of course in the years that followed, the stultification of the situation in the Soviet Union, almost rigor mortis, became more and more apparent. And I really began to despair of the possibility of really changing things there. Although I knew there were good people. I mean, many of the Russians one met at lower levels than the top leadership. I mean, not only Russians, the other people from the other republics, of course, were also very much involved, were very highly intelligent, and one got the impression genuine and sincere and good people, not corrupt or careerists, although they had to play the game according to the rules to get where they were. They weren't dissidents. Most of the ones we met weren't dissidents. So that we knew there were good people there, but the dead weight at the top seemed so enormous that the prospect of change seemed pretty remote. And therefore, when Gorbachev appeared on the scene, and like Khrushchev before him, suddenly things changed, that was a great relief that it happened. About other Soviet leaders, well, Suslov, I saw quite a bit of Suslov because he was very active in the 1960 conference, and he's the one who's usually presented as the ideologist, the sort of palm dut of as we would say, of the Soviet party. And he was again gave the impression of a very dogmatic and inflexible person. Well, I mean, he was perfectly friendly to me in what relations I had with him, but not a very sympathetic person, and the complete opposite of Khrushchev. In some respects, although I don't want to make comparisons between any of them really, it was a bit like the relationship between Pollitt and Dutt in our party and Khrushchev and Suslov over there. And of course in the end Suslov was one of those most active in getting rid of Khrushchev a few years after that.
I'm just going to turn over. Now, the British Party, because of Britain's empire, was particularly influential in winning over young intellectuals in what were the colonies to communism. If we start by talking about India, I know you've unveiled something quite recently in the party archives here, Nehru addressing...
Yes, we found among the microfilms that we've received from Moscow reports of the executive committee in the 1930s, well, it was called the Central Committee then, in the 1930s. Among them is one for July 1938, at which Nehru reported to the British Party's Central Committee on the situation in India. I've only just discovered this and haven't actually read it myself. It's still on microfilm, and it's a bit of a chore to go through the microfilm, but eventually I'll get around to it because it should be interesting. I mean, it's the first time I knew that Nehru had addressed a meeting of the Central Committee of the British Party. But, of course, there's nothing terribly surprising about that, because the British Party had been very involved in helping the Indian progressive movement for many, many years. And, as you know, Ben Bradley was one of the people who were imprisoned at the Meerut trial, because he and one or two other British communists were involved in helping the Indian trade union movement in the late 20s and early 30s, and he was one of those who was sentenced to imprisonment in that trial. And subsequently there'd been close relations with the Indian Party, some of it through Indian communists who came over here to study in Britain. I knew a few of them, including one of their very best and leading people called Mohan Kumara Mangalam, who was president of the Cambridge University in the late 30s. And there were a number of others who were over here. Jyoti Basu is now the Chief Minister of West Bengal. There was someone called Haksar who subsequently came over here to work at the Indian High Commission, I think, or the Indian, I don't know what it's called, the High Commission or the Embassy, or whatever. He became a diplomatic representative of the Indian government, and so on. So there was that sort of relationship, and Dutt in particular, of course, was very much involved because he'd written books about India and was regarded as an authority on India, although subsequently I think the Indian communists in later years disagreed with some of Dutt's views on India and some of his analyses of the situation there. So there was that relationship with India, and there was also a relationship with some of the African people who were over here, African students. Relatively small numbers, but they subsequently played quite an important role in their various countries when they went back, as Nkrumah, for example.
Were these people who were communists before they came to London, or people who came to London as students and became involved in communist activities for the first time in London?
I would think, although I don't know, most of them only became communists after arriving here, but it's possible that they'd had some contact with communist ideas and so on before they came here.
And of course, quite a few of the parties they were going back to work for were clandestine.
Yes. Mm.
And what sort of pressures did that involve on King Street? I mean, you presumably had to be extremely careful about your contacts with them.
Yes, I personally wasn't very much involved in this, so I don't know, as it were, what the mechanics were. I don't think in most, I don't have the impression in most cases that there was a sort of particularly paranoid situation. I mean, as far as the students I knew, the Indian students, for example, they made no particular secret of their communist views and affinities. I can't remember whether at that time the Indian Communist Party was actually illegal. In the late 30s, I don't know much about that setup.
The CPI, as it then was, a unitary party, was moving towards adopting something akin to the parliamentary road about the same time as the British Party was.
I think so, yes.
Was that in any sense in parallel?
Well, everybody to some extent moved in parallel, because at that time we were all members of the Communist International, tended to take the lead from Moscow, and when Moscow gave a hint about a shift in policy, there was a tendency to follow suit. So on this question of the peaceful transition in the West European countries, I mean, you had a series of events. Torres, in a famous interview, you go to the Times, I think in 47, talking about the possibility of a parliamentary road. And in Eastern European countries, they were taking the line that they were going to have a different road to the Soviet road. In those immediate post-war years, before the Tito episode, even in the East European countries, they were talking about their own road to socialism. Then after the fallout with Tito, it became classed as national communism and denounced. And you had this peculiar position where Stalin was riding two horses at the same time. He was denouncing East European communists who might proceed on what he called the national communist deviationist road, but encouraging Western communists like the British and the French to embark on their national road to socialism. And I think it was a reflection of the interests of the Soviet Union as he saw them, namely to keep a close grip on Eastern Europe, but try to form links in Western Europe, not just with the communists, but with social democrats and left people generally. And also, I think Stalin had enough savvy to realize that the old position of denouncing Parliament and having nothing to do with it and regarding violent revolution was just not on anyway in the West. And so I think there was an element of realism in it. But you had this contradictory position that he was running two lines in two different areas of influence.
But the students from India, Africa, were studying in London. Why was the Communist Party such a powerful beacon of attraction, and by contrast, the Labour Party such a weak one?
Well, because I think the party was regarded as the only party which really had consistently and throughout stood for independence from British imperialism and had differentiated itself from British imperialism, whereas the Labour Party had been regarded, particularly in the light of the position taken up by the Labour governments that had existed up to then, as really compromising with imperialism and refusing to break with it. And therefore the British Communist Party was regarded as the party which you could trust on this issue, and that's why they were very much attracted to it.
You met Jyoti Basu, but this was in the late 40s? Not at his time as a student.
Well, I don't really remember Jyoti. I probably did meet him, but if so, it was only briefly, and I don't really recall any discussion of any kind with him. So I don't actually really remember.
When the Indian party split, what was the British party's attitude towards that split?
Well, we tended to side with the CPI as against the CPI Marxists, because the CPI Marxist was taking up a position it seemed to us, very much influenced by Maoism and the ideas of the Chinese, and the others were more along our line, more of our way of thinking, and so in general we tended to support them as against the CPI Marxist. I don't remember. You see, as I say, this was very much the preserve of people like Dutt and subsequently Jack Waddis and others working in the international department, Michael Carrott for a time. And I personally wasn't very much involved in the direct discussions with the Indian people, or in the discussions on the general situation in India, so I don't really regard myself as anything like an expert on this subject of India.
Did you have any dealings with the underground South African Communist Party?
Well, I personally knew a number of the people in the South African Party, like Ruth First, Joe Slovo's wife, who was killed by a bomb later on. I knew Joe himself, not terribly well, but I met him several times. There were other South African communists over here whom I met, and I can't say I had a very close or day-to-day relationship with any of them, but there was there obviously was, as between the British and the South African Party, a very close relationship. Again, it was other people, not myself, who were primarily involved in that. And we used to give whatever support we could to the South African Party. I think we used to help them with sending people over there. There was one chap who went over there who actually got caught and was in prison, but over there because of he was acting as some sort of courier between us. That's right, yes, yeah.
When you say you sent them over on a clandestine basis?
I'm not clear whether they went as it were. They obviously didn't go as open communists. I can't remember now the details of how Sean went. Whether he went as a tour, probably went as a tourist, I would imagine. I don't know. I don't think they were smuggled over the border, that sort of thing. I think they went under some guise or other and then made contact. That was probably how it was done.
Is Sean still in the party?
I've not heard of him for some time. Yeah. I don't know whether he is or not. I've never heard of him for some years, so he probably dropped out. I really don't know.
Is Tony McNally still the West Midlands?
Yes. Yeah, Tony will probably know. Yeah.
One last question. Did you ever meet Castro?
No, I never met Castro.
No, not been to Cuba at all?
Not been to Cuba, no.
What's that one? Is there anything else that you feel you'd like to say, or any personalities you'd like to talk about, or any incidents which come to mind?
I don't know. I think we've covered a pretty fair ground. I don't know if there's anything special apart from that. Switch your thing off and let me have a